The world within a movie is one of the most important things to get right for screenwriter and director. A world needs its own tone and personality to that of any other character within the film. The world and its setting should be established very early on within the film, especially if it's a fictional one with different rules to us. This is because the rules and environment of the world normally have a very big impact on the story. Take for example the Hunger Games. The main plot of this movie revolves around the games, in which children have to kill one another and the last one standing wins. However, they couldn't just open the movie with the start of the Hunger Games. Instead, the viewer needs to understand what kind of society this world has and why they're having these games in the first place. Game of Thrones is an example of a TV show that not only has, but needs a lot of world development, considering how much of the story revolves around society and events that have happened in the past of Westeros. For example, Dany's whole story arc originates from the fact that her family was exiled from Westeros to Essos after Robert's Rebellion. The fact that this world has dragons also massively influences the story because she uses them to gain power, and this is just one example of how the rules and laws of this world influences a character arc. Tyrion gets saved in the first season because in this world you're allowed to have a trial by combat. Most of Jon Snow's story arc takes place at the Night's Watch, which exists because of the Wall. Wildfire allows the Lannisters to get an advantage at the Battle of Blackwater Bay, and is later on used to wipe out most of Cersei's enemies. All these major characters and plot points were influenced by the world this show takes place in and how it works. However, this is a very long show, and so not all the plot devices are established right at the very start, because there's plenty more time to establish them later on. But for films, they don't have this luxury, because the runtime is a lot shorter, and so you have to establish the world and any plot devices that will have a big impact on the story fairly quickly. Another reason this is important is because the tone of the film is largely down to the world that exists within it. An action movie that does this very well is John Wick. The movie spends a lot of time establishing the world John Wick lives in, more specifically the organisation of assassins that he's a part of, the oddly civilised personalities of all the other killers within the organisation, the architecture of their communal buildings, the laws they have in place. They even establish a currency they use. All this detail in the world makes us feel more immersed in it, and it all adds to the tone of the movie as well. It gives the killing a sense of sophistication. If all the other people in the organisation that John Wick is a part of were like Deadpool, and were cracking jokes and were breaking the fourth wall every few minutes, and everything else remained the same, then it wouldn't seem right, because it will lead to a clash of tones within the film. Some aspects of it would seem like an action comedy, but all the other parts of John Wick would seem like it's trying to take itself seriously. So now I'm going to talk about the main movie I'm going to look at today. Children of Men is one of my favourite movies of all time. From the very start, it crafts this world so well that the viewer can't help but be extremely immersed in it, and the world it creates also adds to the general morbid tone of the film. For those who don't know, Children of Men is a film which takes place in a world where all women have become infertile, and so no babies are being born. It takes place about 18 years after this starts happening, and the world has already descended into chaos. The only country remaining that has some sort of political structure is Britain, which has now turned into a far-right dictatorship, in which anyone who tries to get into the country is either sent away or put into a refugee camp with inhumane conditions. From this description, you can tell that it's not a very upbeat film. I'm only going to talk about the first few minutes of the film. These first few minutes are so expertly set up that after they are finished, the viewer already knows exactly what the world is like and what the tone of the movie is going to be. And the way Alfonso Cuarón does this is through visuals. Presenting information is almost always at its most compelling when you do it through visuals, and it can also be used as a very effective way of developing the world the movie takes place in. Most of the time, you don't need dialogue to give information about the setting of the world or an event that takes place before the film. Sometimes the best thing to do is to just show the viewer the world the characters are living in and make them figure out for themselves. How does Children of Men do so well? Well, let's look at the first scene.
1000 of the Siege of Seattle.
The Muslim community demands an end to the army's occupation of mosques.
The Homeland Security Bill is ratified. After 8 years, British borders will remain closed. The deportation of illegal immigrants will continue.
The movie opens with various headlines from a news report, which consists of nothing but violence and protests, but in places you wouldn't expect them to hear that kind of news from. A siege in Seattle and the military occupying all the mosques tells us this isn't a world at peace, It's a world at war.
Good morning. Our lead story.
The world was stunned today by the death of Diego Ricardo, the youngest person on the planet. Baby Diego was stabbed outside a bar in Buenos Aires after refusing to sign an autograph.
It then goes on to report about the murder of the youngest person in the world. If you know nothing about this film, it immediately puts questions into your mind about why the youngest person in the world dying is so significant, and how do they know he's the youngest person in the world in the first place, which in turn makes it very compelling to the viewer. The first shot of the film is of a crowded cafe, a distraught look on everybody's faces. Just from the look of these faces alone sets the mood for the film perfectly, as you know how the people of this world feel. From these first few seconds, you can tell exactly what the tone of this movie is going to be about, and the kind of world this movie is going to take place in. Bleak and hopeless. The fact that this cafe is so tiny and packed further cements how important this news report is, making the audience more eager to find out why it is so significant.
Spat in the face of a fan who asked for an autograph. He was killed in the ensuing brawl. The fan was later beaten to death by the angry crowd.
We are then introduced to the main character, Theo, who sticks out from the others because he seems to be the only one unaffected by the news. He barely pays attention to it, which is a big contrast to everyone else. This immediately makes him compelling to the audience, as we know that he's different to everybody else, and his views on the world and society within it are most likely very different to everybody else's.
The planet was 18 years, 4 months, 20 days, 16 hours, and 8 minutes old.
After he gets his coffee, he moves out of the cafe, and the camera pans the street he walks across, and all our suspicions we have about this world come true. We see a dull sky looming over London, the streets are packed with people, yet we hear very little conversation between them. The sound on the streets is dominated by the motors of cars and tuk-tuks, spewing pollution into the air, showing how this world has almost evolved back into the industrial times, and also shows us how disconnected and afraid everyone is. From this, we can also tell that Theo is an alcoholic. Who else is going to put whiskey in a coffee? The only evidence of joy we get in this scene are two people in the background who seem to be happily greeting each other like old friends. But this brief moment of happiness is quickly snuffed out when this happens. This shows beautifully the brutality of this world this movie takes place in. As soon as there's any sign of affection or kindness, it is immediately destroyed and replaced by pain and suffering. The reason this is one of the best movie openings I've ever seen is because not only does it tell us the key aspects of the main character, but after these couple of minutes are over, we feel like we know so much about this world, and it accomplishes this using only visuals and a news report. One of the first lessons in filmmaking is show, don't tell. It's always better to show the viewer the information and make them interpret it for themselves, rather than tell them the information straight up through dialogue or narration, because then it can come off as patronising or condescending. Think of how worse this opening would be if they used text or narration to tell us the events that have happened in the past year. There would have been no impact to the viewer, but when it's shown like this, that gave me goosebumps.